Yeah, John, I was just mentioning just how one of the things I really loved about your book, besides the bringing kind of life and interesting aspects to species that we usually probably ignore, um, and then taking that not only from your house and your yard, but to your body and all of the crazy interactions and all of the levels of ecosystems and how seemingly unrelated species like giraffes and ants and plants all have this connection. And so what I loved about your book is how you opened up all these new ways of thinking um, about wildlife and particularly the common species.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think, well, just a couple of comments on that. One of the things I wanted to try to to talk about, which I was kind of mentioning earlier, was just appreciating the things that are really common around us, how amazing they are when we begin to learn about them, and that there's just so much to appreciate there, and hoping that that appreciation leads to respect, a little bit more respect for some of these more, you might say, lowly creatures. Um, the other thing that I try to do at the end of the book is talk about how is it that we got to where we are with respect to these creatures? Um, how is it that we feel primarily fear or disgust when we see them, or that we often feel that way? And so I investigate that a little bit. I also talk about, do we have any reason to be morally concerned about how these insects and plants are doing? Do we have some responsibilities as human beings? And talk a little bit about philosophical views, and also world religions as they view these organisms. And I think, very briefly, philosophically, there is what you might call a widening circle of moral concern, where at one time we were, if you go way back in time, um, we didn't have concerns for all human beings, um, much less other organisms. I mean, the Greeks kind of separated the world into Greeks and not Greeks, and the people that you should have moral concern for were the Greeks, not the slaves, not the people from other countries that were barbarians in their view. But as we progress through time, and I won't go into all the details, today there's people that maybe beginning with Albert Schweitzer that will say that we have there's a moral imperative for us to value all living things, all living things. So that circle of moral concern is widening, where we have to be concerned about what's good or bad for some of these other organisms. And at a minimum, hopefully from this book, I hope that people will begin to think more in terms of respecting these smaller organisms that we might not have cared about so much in the past. So shall I respond to some of the questions I have on the chat?
Yeah, there's a few questions, and when you came in, it was I was talking a little bit about insects. So there's a few questions about uh, in, insect decline, and because I know in your book you talk about kind of the blanket use of pesticides and insecticides and herbicides. So there's a question
Yeah.
about is that uh, big ag and urbanization been a factor there, and about affecting the birds and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so certainly pesticides have played a role, and so I fess up in the book to my background working for a pesticide company. I worked for SC Johnson just down the road from Milwaukee in Racine, Wisconsin, but the bigger issue probably for insects generally is insecticides that are used for agriculture. but also some of the bigger issues are habitat loss for insects, as well as a lot of other organisms. I do talk about in the book some cases, particular cases of organisms that are in danger of going extinct. One that was thought to be extinct, and the sort of the Lazarus of endangered species, the Franciscan manzanita in the San Francisco Bay Area, which nearly disappeared and then was spotted one day. They thought it was gone, and it was spotted one day on an island in a very busy road. And this botanist just happened to be driving by and spots this, what looks like an unusual manzanita, and has some other botanists come out and take a look. And lo and behold, it was the Franciscan manzanita, which they thought had been extinct for the last 20 or 30 years. So now today, that manzanita was replanted in the Presidio, if you know San Francisco area, in the Presidio near Golden Gate State Park. And it's living happily in a secret location, and they're trying to breed more from that plant. So, and there's other examples. A great example of habitat loss. I mean, Franciscan manzanita was also part of habitat loss. Is an insect called the American burying beetle. The American burying beetle used to be present across the eastern United States and up into southern Canada. And it was a pretty common insect. But now today it's only found in eastern Oklahoma, a little bit in western Nebraska, and on an island next to Rhode Island called Block Island. And the numbers of the American burying beetle have declined precipitously over the past 100 years or so. Some people say that they were in part dependent on the passenger pigeon, which is, as you know, extinct, but probably habitat loss has a lot more to do with it. Interestingly, the American burying beetle has been the subject of a number of laws or budget proposals in Congress, because it's in areas, particularly in Oklahoma and Texas, where oil drilling and gas drilling is really important. It's caused oil and gas drillers, the fact that it's listed on the Endangered Species Act has caused them to spend more money in developing roads and drilling sites. As a result, senators from Oklahoma have proposed a number of measures to take the American burying beetle off of the endangered species list. The most egregious, I think, of those was trying to claim that the American burying beetle was a threat to the American defense. Because there is a National Guard post in Oklahoma that has been participating in trying to maintain American burying beetles. So it's a crazy situation, and more recently, actually, their status was reduced by the Trump administration to threatened from endangered. So yeah, the habitat loss has been a big issue for a number of organisms. I'll talk about just one more insect that's endangered in Wisconsin, since we're talking in Milwaukee here. The endangered, the Hainze emerald dragonfly up in Door County has been an endangered species in Wisconsin, and it's present. It's another insect that's lost a lot of habitat, and it's present in Door County, a little bit in Michigan, a little bit in the Chicago area, actually, near the Des Plaines River. But it used to be present throughout sort of the Midwest and into the lower Midwest. It's a beautiful green dragonfly, and it's maintained its populations pretty well in Door County. One of the big threats to this dragonfly is cars. And there's been discussions about how to reduce the collisions between cars and dragonflies so to preserve this endangered species. And they've talked about things like putting fences up alongside highways and roads so that the dragonflies will fly over and not come down and be hit by fly too low and be hit by the cars. They've also talked about changing speed limits to help these dragonflies. So if you can find your way to go just a little bit slower up in Door County, you might save a few emerald dragonflies, Hainze emerald dragonflies.
I do want to mention that Daniel did post the link to buy the book. Again, I encourage you to do that. There's also a couple of interesting links and some dandelion shortbread and probably my favorite wildlife artist, Kristen Yersitz, on the call, and she also posted a link to a piece of art of the common. And I have a quick question for you, John. I'm just curious that how you chose the species to include in this book, and I know you kind of mentioned at the end that these are species that don't normally get a lot of love, but are there any species that kind of like almost made the cut, and you decided to maybe do for next round 2 or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because part of the fun of putting this together was thinking about which organisms to talk about. I didn't want to talk just about insects, but I wanted to talk about other smaller organisms. And there's plants in there. I talked about the Franciscan manzanita just a minute ago, and crabgrass and dandelions. And the idea is through these stories to try and again generate some appreciation and respect for some of the plants and insects or arthropods that we find around us that are almost mundane in our lives, and somehow we almost don't see them. I saw an article recently about something called plant blindness. And the idea of the article was that there are a lot of plants that we pass by every day and we become blind to them. We don't see them in the same way that we might see plants when we actually go out to go for a hike in nature or something like that. And so, I think the idea was to start to get people to be more aware of their surroundings. And as I said a little bit earlier, if there was ever a time to spend time looking at the weeds and the insects around your house, this would be it when we're spending so much time at home. I try not to talk about insects, for example, that are so well known, like cockroaches. I mean, that would be an easy one to talk about. But try to pick some insects where there's interesting stories but that also sort of get the point across. I mean, second chapter is about how we benefit, how human beings benefit from certain plants and insects. And so it was a lot of the fun of it was which organisms to choose to talk about in the book, for sure.
In addition to having an excellent wildlife artist in Kristen, we also have a couple of I might say maybe the most beetle crazed community scientists I know. John and Heidi are beetle collectors, and they're finding new records to the state of Wisconsin. When we go on bird walks, they'll pick up a piece of fruit on the ground and look for these tiny beetles and bring them home and identify them. And so one of the questions that Heidi had earlier is, where do you look for beetles? And I guess knowing that you have 2 beetle enthusiasts that are finding new records for Milwaukee, do you have any advice to them about finding these little beetles?
Well, it sounds like they're pretty good at it already. But Wisconsin has there's a group called the Wisconsin Entomological Society. I don't know if you guys participate. That's a great organization, and they go out on field trips. And there's actually a fellow No, no, his name is escaping me. At the university there, Dan Young, who's a beetle expert, and he'd be a great. If you don't know Dan Young at University of Wisconsin at Madison, you should get to know him if you're interested in beetles. He can really set you onto some great spots and interesting beetles. For me, I love one of the things I love in Wisconsin are the tiger beetles. I don't know if you guys have spent time with tiger beetles. Find them often on sandy beaches, that sort of thing. They trap other insects and capture them and feed on them. They're really fast and they're really beautiful insects, tiger beetles.
I also want to point out that Kim shared a bioscience article on the plant blindness that you referred to. And then there's another comment from Robin about, I think this was a book that she read that talks about the reduction of nature vocabulary in our day-to-day conversation that also leads to a form of blindness. I guess in this case, it's a reduction of the vocabulary that and Robin, speak up if I'm not presenting this right, but in the reduction of our vocabulary, if you don't have these details of nature to work into your vernacular.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that. That's so interesting, and I'm sure it's true. And you know, one of the things that I've enjoyed about being here in Seattle most recently is the interaction of the indigenous peoples here on environmental issues, and I just, when you talked about the vocabulary related to nature, it's just been really interesting to their sensitivity to what's going on in the environment as a group, and their experience of the environment and their vocabulary for talking about what they kind of their culture and how it relates to the environment. So that's been really great about being out here, and certainly that's the case in the Midwest as well.
This kind of brings us to one of the earlier questions, which somebody asked, what are your favorite, I think your favorite nature reads or books, and when you mentioned the indigenous communities in Seattle, I certainly, one of my favorite books that I read over and over again is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer, particularly when you talk about the kind of traditional knowledge, the traditional way of knowing things versus the kind of the Western scientific way of learning things, which is not the only way to learn about the world. It's a great tool, but again, some of this traditional ecological knowledge is huge benefits, both whether it's vocabulary, understanding how the world works in a different way. And so I can say that's one of my favorite nature books. And I don't know if you're about to say something else, or if you wanted to chime in about what you like to read.
Oh, what I was going to say is, you mentioned Kristen as an illustrator. I just wanted to put in just make a note about the Angela Mele, who illustrated this book. She really did some wonderful illustrations, and the colored illustrations are on the cover of the book, which I think you've probably seen, and the black and white drawings had the chapters. That she did a really nice job. But now that I know about Kristen, if I get another book going here, well, I'll have to give her a call.
She is something else.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Love to see this, the business about the dandelion shortbread and the questions about the insects, the decline in insects. I'm going to just scroll down here and see what other questions we have.
There's a question here on murder hornets that I'm also curious to know what's your perspective on that and the fear around them in the media and the public.
Yes, well, I'm in the home of murder hornets.
That's right.
Yeah, the giant hornet, but giant Asian hornet, I think they're calling it. I'm not a big fan of the location names, but Yeah, so recently there have been two more discoveries. One was on somebody's front porch or something where they stepped on it and killed it. Um, and I forget, I can't remember where the other one was. There's the state of Washington and I think the USDA also is involved in looking for these hornets and trying to trap them and figure out what's going on. There's a concern that there probably is a nest here. They came here. Well, actually, they were found up in British Columbia first, and then now we're finding a few down in Washington State. So it's as happens. I think that you may have recognized in what you've read about these insects that there's probably been a bit of media overblown activity on this. The murder hornets is a bit of a misnomer. They do, from what I understand, I haven't experienced it. They do have a very painful sting, and like many other stinging insects, if you're allergic, of course, it's a problem. And if you get multiple stings, it can be a problem for people. We have fatalities in this country from stinging insects on a regular basis annually, and primarily due to people being allergic to the stings. I don't mean to downplay the seriousness of the stings of this giant hornet, because they are very painful and harmful, but they're not really murder hornets. Certainly a single sting wouldn't kill anybody unless they were allergic. The bigger concern about these hornets, which come from Asia, is that they will harm bee colonies. They swarm bee colonies and kill the bees, eat the contents of the hive, both the larvae of the bees and the honey. They are a threat to the bee industry. On the other hand, the Japanese bee industry is thriving where they have these giant hornets, and they are managing the problem with smaller openings or to the hives or other guards on the hives so that the giant hornets can't enter. So they're finding a way to manage them, and I expect that if the giant hornets did become established in North America, our beekeepers would find ways to manage the threat as well.
But if you put it that way, John, then there's no hysteria around it, and it's not any fun. So
yeah. Well, I think it's a lot of fun. I mean, I think they're super interesting. I'm not. I mean, it's hard to be in favor of invasive insects and plants and that sort of thing. But I think they're really interesting insects, and maybe best to say really interesting in their own environment. And I'd like to be able to see them myself, but I guess unless I get lucky here in Washington, I'm going to have to make a trip to Japan to see them. But they're a bit overblown, I would say, at this point. They are to be taken seriously. They are a threat to the bee industry, but there's things we can do. And the threat of the sting, unless you really get into a nest or something like that, is probably not that significant, just painful.
So with 1 minute left, I have a question for you. What is you can answer either or both. What's your next book, and what are you currently reading that you're enjoying?
I actually am working on another book, and it's related to this whole question of, you might have picked up on some of my enthusiasm for the question of endangered species. And what I'm interested in is how we make choices. If we say that our resources are limited to preserve species, which do we preserve? So I'm kind of thinking about it in terms of who gets on the ark, which organisms get on the ark. How do we make choices about which endangered species we preserve? And I'm thinking about the Endangered Species Act in the United States, and what were we thinking with the Endangered Species Act? To begin with, did the Congress recognize the implications of the act in that in an immediate outcome, the snail darter, this tiny minnow, would stop a giant dam project for the Tennessee Valley Authority? Was that a surprise, or was that the kind of nature they were intending to preserve? So those are the kind of questions I'm thinking about and working on as I consider the next book, sort of like Who Gets on the Ark book. In terms of reading, I have a book actually given to me by my daughter, Emily, who's on the call, or who's on this thing. So hello to Emily. It's a book by Mary Oliver. It's some of her essays, which I am really enjoying. I think she's a really wonderful author, poet, and essayist. Just an unusual way of looking at nature. Not science by any means, but certainly scientifically valid, everything she says, but a really wonderful way of seeing nature and experiencing it. So she's a great read. I love reading Bill McKibben, and I think he has a lot of important things to say right now. Highly recommend him. So I thought I would just finish by reading from the end of the book, if I could. And that's just very short, just to say that we are surrounded every day by wondrous examples of explosive life that fills every nook and cranny of human-created buildings and landscapes. The life that faces us at every turn, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, deserves treatment worthy of a representative of the marvelous and unlikely development of life on Earth. Look again in the basement, where two silverfish meet, shyly touching antennae. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And take a second look at those silverfish in your house. Maybe give them a little space.
I'm going to remind folks that Nature Underfoot is available through Boswell. Don't forget, if you are able, to contribute to the Urban Ecology Center and help them do their wonderful work that we all benefit from. I'd like to thank John as well as Tim and the Urban Ecology Center. Looking forward to your next book, John, and thank all of you for coming, because we would not have a bookstore or a nature center without you.